Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video I'm going to talk about labour markets, so the market for people in an economy. Now, it's not about slavery, we're talking about the legal employment of people by firms in an economy. Let's start at the beginning. If we are talking about a labour market, what we are talking about is people supplying their labour to firms for a wage to help firms produce goods and services in an economy. Labour is the resource and firms are employing that resource to then produce goods and services and help satisfy demand in an economy. So let's just rewind for a second. If we think about a product market, right? A product market is the market for a good or service in an economy. So let's say we're talking about cameras, the market for cameras. If we talk about that market, that demand for cameras comes from consumers. Consumers want to go out, buy the latest camera and take fancy pictures of the Harbour Bridge at night. If we think about who is making the cameras to then provide them to the market, we are talking about firms. Firms are creating the cameras and then selling them to consumers. So if we think about market equilibrium for a product market, demand comes from consumers, supply comes from firms. That's how it is arranged. If we then think about the labour market, which is, well, our focus for this video, the labour market works a little bit differently. Because if you think about it, in terms of labour, it is individuals who are supplying their labour. It is not firms who are supplying their labour. It is people like you and me that are saying, yep, I'd like to work, employ me for a wage, and I'll help you produce your goods and services. And then if we think about who wants this labour, who demands this labour, if you will, that's the firms. They want the labour to then come and work for them to help produce the goods and services. So if we think about this in terms of market equilibrium, that the supply of labour comes from people, individuals. The demand for labour, well, that comes from firms. So it's actually working the opposite way to a product market. A product market, demand comes from consumers, supply comes from firms. Think back to that camera analogy. If we think about the labour market is what's known as the factor market. That means it is the market for a resource in the economy. So if we talk about the labour market, that supply comes from individuals, they are supplying their labour, and demand comes from firms. They want the workers to help them produce goods and services. Okay, so we've set this up. What we're going to do now is we'll draw what a labour market looks like and we'll compare it with a product market as well, so you can see how they compare. Okay, let's go do that now. Okay, so what we've got is we've got two outlines for market equilibrium. What I want to do is I want to compare a product market and the labour market just to show you how they differ. So if we put on the left-hand side, we'll say, okay, this will be the product market, and then over here, we'll have the labour market. So in both markets, this still represents supply, that still represents demand, all of that stuff is the same. And then what we can also do, that we can also label the points as still market equilibrium, but I'm just going to hold off on one thing here. So let's say that that's still QE. So if we look at a product market, that this is price, right? That this represents the price of the good or the service in the market. And then this here represents quantity. This is the quantity of the good, that this represents the quantity of good or service in the market. Okay, so this is our product market. If we go a little bit deeper here, we can say that in a product market, that demand comes from consumers. Consumers are the ones that want the cameras. Supply, on the other hand, supply comes from firms. They are the ones who supply the cameras, right? So in a product market, if we talk about supply, that is firms. If we talk about demand, that is consumers. Okay, what we'll do is we'll shift across now, we'll put this in yellow, and we'll go to the labour market. So if we think about price, I'm just going to put this in purple just to distinguish it from the other one. So if we look here, we're no longer talking about price, right? What we're talking about instead here, so we're talking about wage rates, because if we think about it, the price of labor is wages, okay? So it's important. We're talking about wage rates. We've still got zero happening here, but over here, we're no longer talking about the quantity of goods and services. Instead, we're talking about the quantity of labor. So we're talking about how much labor is demanded and how much is supplied. So if we're thinking about this axis now represents wage rates, we can say that that represents the equilibrium wage, WE. Here it was PE, here it is WE. Okay, so we've still got there quantity E, that's the equilibrium quantity of labor, just as here QE is the equilibrium quantity of goods and services. So one final thing to think about here is that in a labor market, it works a little bit differently in terms of supply and demand. That if we think about supply, the supply of labor comes from individuals, people like you and me that are supplying their labor to the market. And demand in this situation comes from firms. Firms are the ones who are demanding labor to then be able to produce the goods and services in the economy. So in a labor market, supply, okay, that's from individuals. Demand, okay, that comes from firms, from businesses that need labor to be able to produce goods and services. So if we think about this as a whole, I'll just put a little asterisk here, that a labor market is a particular type of market. It's not a product market, it's a factor market. A factor here relating to a factor of production. A factor of production or a resource, right? A factor market involves inputs into the production process. So labor, which is used by firms to make the goods and services to then sell them to consumers in the product market. Okay, so this is a visual depiction of how we would distinguish between a product market and a labor market. Just be very clear that in a labor market, supply is individuals, not firms, and demand is firms, not consumers, as it is in the product market. So this was an introductory look at a labor market. The key thing to remember is that a labor market is a factor market. It's about a resource for production. So in that way, supply comes from individuals and demand comes from consumers. Okay, any questions or comments, put them in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.